My name is Renata Cole. I'm 34 years old, and I found out my father forged my signature on a deed exactly 12 minutes before I was supposed to walk my own sister down the aisle. I was standing in the church vestibule in a champagne-colored dress, holding a bouquet of ranunculus I'd arranged myself at 6 that morning, when my phone buzzed with an email from the county recorder's office. I almost didn't open it. I told myself it could wait until after the ceremony. Something in my chest, the same something that has kept me alive through every family dinner I've ever survived, told me to open it right there in the vestibule, with the organ already playing the prelude. The subject line read, "Property Fraud Alert. A new document has been recorded against your monitored property." I stood very still while 3 bridesmaids fussed with my sister's veil 6 feet away. I read that my father, Warren Cole, and my mother, Diane Cole, had filed a quitclaim deed transferring my late grandmother's farmhouse, the one with my name on the title, into a trust controlled entirely by them. Not my sister's name, mine, forged, notarized by a man I have never once met in my life. I am an ICU nurse. I have held the hands of people while machines counted down the last of their heartbeats, and I have learned to keep my face perfectly still while my whole body screams underneath it. That skill is the only reason I did not drop my bouquet on the vestibule floor. I want you to understand exactly where I was standing when I found this out, because the location matters. This was my sister Josephine's wedding day. Josie is 29, 3 years younger than me, and she has spent her entire life as the daughter my parents actually wanted. I had agreed months earlier, against every instinct I've built since I was a teenager, to walk her down the aisle in place of our father, because our father had a bad hip, and Josie thought it would be sentimental for her big sister to give her away instead. I said yes because some small idiot part of me still wanted to believe that agreeing to beautiful, generous things would eventually earn me a seat at the family table that wasn't at the far end near the kitchen door. I have spent 34 years learning that it never does. I just keep forgetting the lesson in new and expensive ways. Before I tell you what happened after I read that email, and trust me, what happened in the next 40 minutes inside that church is the reason I'm telling you this story at all, take a second and hit subscribe if stories about quiet women who stop being quiet mean something to you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one of them, and on nights like the one I'm about to describe to you, knowing strangers are out there listening is the only thing that made the silence in my own family feel survivable. I folded my phone screen down against my palm, and I looked at my reflection in the tall vestibule mirror. Champagne dress, hair pinned the way my grandmother used to pin hers, calm face, steady hands. Behind me, through the propped open doors, I could see the pews filling with 200 guests. Half of them my parents' friends from the country club, half of them people who had watched me get quietly erased from this family since I was 12 years old and had simply decided that was none of their business. My mother was somewhere near the front, already dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, rehearsing the tears she would perform beautifully in about 20 minutes, when her younger daughter walked down the aisle on the arm of the sister she had spent 3 decades making sure never quite belonged. I want to be honest with you about what I felt standing there, because I think the honest part is the part that matters most. I did not feel rage, not yet. I felt something colder and much older than rage. I felt the specific, familiar drop in my stomach that I have felt every single time this family has shown me exactly what I am worth to them, and every single time I have managed to convince myself it would be different this time. This time, I had said yes to walking my sister down the aisle. This time I had spent $4,000 of my own money on this dress and on the flowers because Josie's florist budget had run out, and nobody in my family had thought to ask if that was fair to me. This time I had told myself, standing right there in that mirror, 20 minutes before I opened that email, that maybe today was the day they finally treated me like a daughter instead of a convenient body to fill a gap in the ceremony. The email did not just tell me about a forged deed, it told me, in the flattest possible legal language, exactly how much I mattered to the 2 people who raised me. My grandmother, Eleanor Voss, had left me that farmhouse 18 months earlier, specifically because she had watched my parents favor Josie in every measurable way for 30 years, and she had told me plainly at her kitchen table the year before she died that she was not going to let that pattern follow me past her own grave. She had made me promise to hold on to that house no matter what pressure came. I had signed nothing, requested nothing, agreed to nothing, and yet there in my inbox, 12 minutes before the wedding march, was proof that my own father had walked into a notary's office with a woman claiming to be me, and signed my grandmother's gift over into a trust he and my mother controlled completely. I looked up from my phone, and I saw my father through the propped open sanctuary doors, standing near the front in his good gray suit, leaning on his cane, laughing warmly at something one of Josie's future in-laws had said. He looked exactly like a proud father should look on his daughter's wedding day. I watched him laugh, and I thought about the fact that he had planned this timing on purpose, filing the paperwork the same week as the wedding, because he knew every single person in my family would be too consumed by lace and seating charts and champagne toasts to notice a county recorder's notice landing quietly in an inbox. He had underestimated exactly one thing, and it is the only thing that has ever mattered in this entire story. He did not know that 8 months earlier, on the advice of a lawyer my grandmother herself had introduced me to before she passed, I had enrolled that farmhouse in a property fraud alert system that would notify me the instant anyone tried to file anything against it. He thought he was moving in silence. He had no idea I would know within minutes. I slid my phone into the small clutch I was carrying, and I looked at my reflection one more time. Steady hands, calm face. A woman who had spent her whole life being handed less and somehow, impossibly, being asked to smile while she carried it. The organ shifted into the opening notes of the processional, and Josie appeared at the end of the hallway in her gown, radiant, oblivious, already crying happy tears that our mother had rehearsed crying beside her. I linked my arm through hers, because I love my sister, whatever else is true in this family, and because whatever my parents had just done was not her fault, and I was not going to let it become her wedding story. Not yet, not there. But as we started down that aisle together, 200 faces turning to watch us, I already knew that before this night ended, I was going to have a very different conversation with my father, and this time I was not walking into it with nothing in my hands. To understand why a forged deed felt less like a shock and more like the final page of a book I had been reading my whole life, you need to go back with me to the summer I turned 12, the summer I learned exactly how the math worked in the Cole household. We lived in a modest brick colonial in Ashford, Pennsylvania, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business and nobody ever said the quiet part out loud. My father sold insurance for a regional firm and wore the same brown blazer to every open house for a decade. My mother ran the front desk at a pediatric dental office and organized our family the way she organized her appointment book, with certain names always penciled in first and certain names always squeezed into whatever time was left over. Josie was born 3 years after me, and from the moment she could walk, she was the name written in ink at the top of every page. I don't say this to make myself sound like a martyr, because I wasn't one. I was just a kid who noticed things, the way quiet kids always do. I noticed that Josie's ballet recitals got the good camera, the one my father charged the night before and packed extra batteries for, while my school spelling bee got a shrug and a "we'll try to make it" that, somehow never once turned into actually making it. I noticed that when Josie broke her arm falling off her bike at 9 years old, my mother took 2 weeks off work to nurse her through it, made her tea, let her skip chores, and treated the cast like a medal of honor. When I broke my wrist at 11, falling out of the oak tree in our backyard, my mother drove me to urgent care, sat in the waiting room reading a magazine, and told me on the way home that I needed to be more careful because we didn't have money for reckless accidents. Same injury, 2 different daughters, 2 entirely different families showing up for them. The summer I turned 12 was the summer the pattern stopped being something I only felt in my chest and became something I could actually name. My grandmother Eleanor, my mother's mother, had come to stay with us for 6 weeks while her own house got new plumbing put in, and she was the kind of woman who noticed everything and said most of it out loud, which made my parents nervous in a way I didn't understand until years later. One evening at dinner, my father announced that Josie had been accepted into a competitive summer arts intensive, 2 states away, 4 weeks of tuition, room, and board, that cost more than my parents' car payment for the year. He said it with the kind of pride that made the whole table glow, and my mother immediately started planning what to pack. I remember sitting there with a spelling bee trophy from that spring, still sitting on the bookshelf in the den, a trophy nobody had mentioned once since the night I won it, and I remember doing quiet 12-year-old math in my head about what that 4-week program probably cost compared to what my own school supplies had cost that August, the ones my mother had grumbled about the whole drive home from the store. That night, after the dishes were cleared and Josie had already gone upstairs humming show tunes, I sat on the back porch steps in the dark because the house felt too loud with everyone else's excitement, and my grandmother came out and sat down beside me, without saying anything for a long while. She smelled like the lavender soap she always kept in her suitcase, and she had a way of sitting very still that made you feel like whatever you eventually said would actually be heard. Finally, she asked me plainly whether it bothered me, watching all this happen for Josie. I told her it didn't, the way children lie when they've already learned that telling the truth about being hurt just gets you labeled dramatic. My grandmother didn't push. She just put her hand over mine on the porch step and said something I didn't fully understand until I was much older. She said, "Renata, some parents only have room in their hearts for one kind of daughter, and the terrible thing is, they never tell the other one. They just let her figure it out on her own, year after year, like a puzzle with a missing piece nobody warns her about." I carried that sentence with me for the rest of my childhood, turning it over the way you turn over a stone in your pocket. Over the next several years, the pattern only sharpened. When I made the honor roll every single semester of high school, my parents signed the permission slip for the awards ceremony and then didn't attend, citing a scheduling conflict that turned out, when I found out later through a cousin, to be nothing more than a Saturday morning they'd rather have spent sleeping in. When Josie made the junior varsity cheerleading squad, my mother threw a small celebration dinner at the Italian place downtown, with a cake that said "Congratulations" in blue frosting. When I got into the nursing program at Penn State on a partial academic scholarship, the news was met with a nod over dinner, and a comment from my father about how nursing was a practical choice for someone who wasn't going to be, and here he actually paused mid-sentence before finishing it, someone who wasn't going to be quite as remarkable as her sister. I want to pause here because I know some of you listening have lived some version of this exact math, watching a sibling get the camera charged, the celebration planned, the tuition paid, while you learn to celebrate your own wins quietly, alone, in your bedroom with the door shut so nobody would ask why you were crying over something good. If that's you, and I think a lot of you know exactly what I mean, I want you to comment the words "I see you" below, because I promise you, someone did eventually see me too, and her name was about to change everything about the life I thought I was destined to live. The financial gap widened as we got older in ways that stopped being subtle and started being simply undeniable. My parents paid for Josie's entire college education at a private university, 4 years, no loans, a graduation trip to Europe afterwards that my father called an investment in her future. I paid for my own nursing degree through that partial scholarship, 2 part-time jobs, and student loans I am still paying off today, more than a decade later, with interest that compounds every single month like a quiet reminder of exactly where I ranked in that household's priorities. When Josie's car broke down her sophomore year, my parents bought her a newer used car within the week. No lecture, no conditions, just done. When my own car broke down during my clinical rotations, I was told gently that money was tight that month and perhaps I could carpool with a classmate for a while, which I did. For nearly 4 months, waking up 90 minutes earlier every single day so I wouldn't be late to a hospital where I was learning to save lives that my own parents seemed to think weren't worth investing in. The cruelest part, the part I think takes people outside a family like mine the longest to understand, is that none of it ever happened with shouting or cruelty you could point to and name. Nobody ever told me outright that I mattered less. It was always logistics, always practicality, always a scheduling conflict, or a budget concern, or a well, she's just built differently than her sister. Said with a soft, almost affectionate laugh, as though being built differently were a fond little quirk, and not a life sentence handed down before I was even old enough to understand what sentence I was serving. I learned to stop expecting the camera to be charged for me. I learned to stop mentioning my own wins at the dinner table, because mentioning them only ever earned a distracted nod before the conversation drifted back, inevitably and completely, to whatever Josie had accomplished that week. By the time I turned 22 and graduated from nursing school with honors, walking across that stage while my parents sat in the audience because Josie's college roommate's wedding shower conflicted with the ceremony and they had, in the end, chosen the shower, I had already built the only kind of armor a child in my position could build. I had stopped needing them to see me at all, or at least I had convinced myself I had, right up until the one person who actually did see me sat me down at her kitchen table 18 months before she died, and told me she had spent years quietly making sure I would never have to live the rest of my life on the scraps my parents were willing to spare. My grandmother, Eleanor Voss, lived 40 minutes outside Ashford, in a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a barn that hadn't held animals in decades, but still smelled faintly of hay and old wood every time you opened its doors. From the time I was small, that house felt like the only place in my entire world where the math actually balanced. She never once compared me to Josie. She never once glanced at my report card the way my parents did, searching for the acceptable version of good enough before moving on to the next subject. She would sit across from me at that same scarred kitchen table for hours, asking me actual questions about what I thought, what I wanted, what scared me, and then she would wait, patiently, for the whole answer, the way you wait for someone you have decided is worth the time. It was my grandmother who first noticed, out loud, that something in our family had been quietly broken for years. I was 14 the summer. She finally said it plainly, instead of just hinting at it on porch steps. We were shelling peas on that same porch, the sun going gold over the back field, and I mentioned, casually, the way kids mention things they've buried so deep they've stopped realizing how much the burial cost them, that Josie was starting private violin lessons that fall because our parents wanted her to have every opportunity. My grandmother's hands went still over the bowl of peas. She looked at me for a long moment and then she asked, very quietly, whether anyone had ever asked me what opportunities I wanted. I remember sitting there, not knowing how to answer, because nobody ever had, and because some part of me had genuinely never considered that the question was allowed to be asked. That was the year my grandmother started what she called our Sunday project, though it took me years to understand it was never really about the project itself. Every other Sunday, I would take the bus out to her farmhouse, and we would work on something together, canning tomatoes, mending the fence, reorganizing her bookshelves by color the way she liked them, and in between the work, she would teach me things nobody else in my life bothered to teach me. She taught me how to read a bank statement line by line and understand exactly where every dollar went. She taught me how to negotiate a price at a farmer's market without feeling guilty about it. She taught me, without ever quite saying so directly, that the version of me my parents had decided wasn't worth investing in was not the only version available, that I could build something entirely separate from their approval, and it would still count, it would still matter, it would still be mine. She also, and this is the part that took me the longest to fully appreciate, quietly started keeping records. I didn't know it at the time, not for years, but my grandmother had begun writing things down, dates, amounts, small factual notes about the tuition checks, and the graduation trips, and the new cars, comparing them against what little had ever been spent on me. She told me much later, sitting at that same table when I was in my late 20s, that she had started that habit the summer of the peas, the summer she finally understood exactly what kind of family her daughter had built, and exactly what it was doing to the granddaughter she loved most. She said she couldn't undo 30 years of my parents' choices, but she could make sure that when the time came, there would be an honest record of what had actually happened, one that no amount of rewriting at a dinner table could erase. I want to tell you about the year everything nearly fell apart for me, because it's the year my grandmother's steady presence became the difference between surviving and not. I was 19, in my second year of nursing prerequisites, working 2 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night, and I got the flu badly enough that I ended up in the emergency room with a fever of 104. I called my mother from the hospital bed, genuinely frightened, and she told me she'd try to come by after her shift ended, but that Josie had a college visit scheduled that same afternoon, and she really couldn't miss driving her to that. My father never called back at all. I lay in that hospital bed alone for 6 hours, until my grandmother, 73 years old at the time, drove 40 minutes through rush hour traffic the second she heard, sat beside my bed holding my hand, and told the nurses in no uncertain terms that she would be staying the night whether there was a chair for her or not. She stayed until 3 in the morning. She never once mentioned that my parents hadn't come. She didn't have to. We both already knew. If you've ever had one person in your family who showed up when everyone else found a reason not to, someone whose presence alone taught you that you were worth showing up for, I want you to drop their name in the comments right now, even just their first name, because I think naming the people who saved us matters, and I think it matters that we say it out loud instead of carrying it silently the way I carried mine for years. By the time I finished nursing school and started working in the ICU, my grandmother had become something closer to a second mother than a grandmother, though she never once tried to compete with the role my actual mother should have filled. She came to my white coat ceremony when my parents said the drive was inconvenient on a weeknight. She sat in the front row at my pinning ceremony, applauding so loudly I had to hush her, laughing the whole time, while my parents sent a card 2 days late with $20 folded inside it. She was the one who helped me find my first apartment, the one who co-signed my very first car loan when the dealership balked at my thin credit history, the one who sat with me at her kitchen table the night I got my first full-time ICU offer, and told me, with tears actually standing in her eyes, that she had never once doubted what I was capable of, not for a single day since the summer of the peas. The farmhouse conversation, the one that changed everything, happened 18 months before she died, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early spring. She had asked me to come out for dinner, nothing unusual, we did it most weeks by then, but this time she had a folder waiting on the table beside her plate, a plain manila folder that she slid toward me before we'd even finished eating. Inside were photocopies of decades of financial records, the tuition payments, the cars, the trips, all of it laid out in her careful handwriting, comparing dollar for dollar exactly what had been spent on Josie against what had been spent on me. She told me she had decided, and had already begun the legal process, to leave me the farmhouse outright, in my name only, along with a modest savings account she had built quietly over the years, specifically for this purpose. She told me she was not doing it out of pity, and she was not doing it to punish my parents, though she suspected it would feel that way to them regardless. She was doing it, she said, holding both my hands across that same scarred table, because she had watched a little girl shell peas beside her one summer, and had decided right then that somebody in this family needed to make sure that little girl's worth was written down somewhere permanent, in ink nobody could quietly erase later. She made me promise, looking me dead in the eyes the way only she could, that whatever pressure ever came, whatever guilt anyone in this family tried to hand me about that house, I would hold on to it, because it wasn't just a piece of property to her. It was proof that somebody had finally done the math correctly and had made sure the answer belonged to me. My grandmother passed away 11 months after that conversation at her kitchen table, quietly, in her sleep, on a Thursday morning in late winter, and I was the one who found her, because I had let myself in with my own key to bring her the groceries she'd asked for the night before. I sat with her for almost an hour before I called anyone, holding the same hand that had held mine through that flu at 19, and I told her, out loud, in that empty farmhouse kitchen, that I would keep every promise I had ever made her. I did not know yet exactly how hard that promise would be to keep, or exactly how many people would eventually try to talk me out of it, but I made it anyway, because some promises you make to the dead are the only ones you get to keep perfectly, and I was not going to fail this one. The will reading happened 3 weeks later in a small law office in downtown Ashford, and I remember exactly how the room felt when the attorney, a careful man named Foster Grant who had handled my grandmother's affairs for over a decade, read out the line leaving the farmhouse and its surrounding 12 acres solely to me. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do before, a kind of controlled flatness that I would later recognize as the same expression she wore whenever something happened that she had absolutely no intention of accepting gracefully. My father said nothing at all in that meeting, which, in hindsight, should have told me more than any outburst could have. Josie, to her credit, looked genuinely surprised and even squeezed my hand under the table, whispering that she was happy for me, and I believed her then, and I still believe she meant it in that exact moment, because whatever else is true about my sister, she has never been the architect of the cruelty in our family. She has only ever been its favored beneficiary, which is a very different thing, though it took me years to fully separate the two. I want to tell you what I did with that farmhouse over the next several years, because it matters for everything that came after. I did not sell it. I did not rent it out for passive income, and forgot about it the way my father clearly assumed I would, once the initial grief faded. I moved into it myself, 6 months after my grandmother died, driving out every evening after brutal 12-hour ICU shifts to slowly restore the place room by room with my own 2 hands and whatever money I could set aside from my nursing salary. I refinished the kitchen table, where she had taught me to shell peas and read bank statements. I repainted the porch, where she had told me, at 14, that some parents only have room in their hearts for one kind of daughter. I planted a garden in the exact spot where her old vegetable rows used to run, and every single tomato I grew there felt like a small, private argument I was winning against everyone who had ever told me, in 100 quiet ways, that I wasn't worth the investment. At the same time, my career was building into something I am genuinely proud of, not because I need anyone's validation to say so anymore, but because it matters to the story I'm telling you. I moved from a general medical floor into the intensive care unit within 3 years of graduating, one of the youngest nurses on my hospital's cardiac ICU team, and within 6 years, I was training incoming staff and sitting on the unit's quality improvement committee. I bought my own car outright, paid off in full, sitting in that farmhouse driveway as a small monument to every 90-minute carpool morning I had once endured. I paid down my student loans steadily, aggressively, treating every extra payment like a brick laid in a foundation nobody was ever going to be able to pull out from underneath me again. I built a life that was quiet and steady, and entirely mine, built without a single dollar or a single ounce of approval from the 2 people who raised me, and there is a particular kind of peace that comes from realizing you have become exactly the person your childhood tried to convince you could never exist. Meanwhile, back in Ashford, a different story was quietly unfolding, one I only pieced together in fragments over the years from cousins and old family friends who couldn't help mentioning things at holiday gatherings I still occasionally attended out of habit, and a lingering, stubborn hope. Josie's private university education, the one my parents had funded in full without blinking, led to a marketing degree she used for exactly 14 months before deciding corporate work wasn't fulfilling. My parents supported her through a string of ventures after that, a boutique that closed within a year, an online business that never quite launched, 6 months of culinary school that ended without a certificate. Every single one of these attempts was funded, cushioned, and forgiven by my parents in a way that never once resembled the treatment I had received when my own car broke down during nursing school. I want to be careful here, because I don't say this to diminish Josie as a person. She was simply raised inside a system that told her failure came with a safety net. The same system that told me failure, or even simple need, came with a lecture about budgets and practicality. By the time Josie turned 27, 2 years before her wedding, my parents' own finances had quietly begun showing cracks. Cracks I wouldn't fully understand the size of until much later. My father's insurance job had been eliminated in a company restructuring, and rather than downsizing their lifestyle, they had continued funding Josie's various ventures and maintaining the country club membership and the two-car garage they'd always had, dipping steadily into savings that had once seemed, from a child's perspective, bottomless. I didn't know any of this in real detail at the time. What I knew was that the tone of our occasional phone calls had started to shift, subtly at first, my mother asking more questions about my job, my finances, whether nursing paid well these days, whether the farmhouse had appreciated since my grandmother's passing. I answered honestly and without much thought, because I still, even then, hadn't fully learned to treat every question from my parents as a data-gathering mission, rather than genuine interest in my life. If you've ever built a life so quietly solid that the people who once dismissed you started circling back around it, asking careful questions they never used to bother asking, I want you to comment the words "I built it myself" below, because I think there is something powerful in naming exactly what you built when nobody else was willing to invest in you, and I want this comment section full of people who did precisely that. The engagement announcement came the spring before the wedding. Josie and a kind, unremarkable man named Preston she had met through mutual friends, and my parents threw an engagement party at the country club that must have cost more than my entire first year's salary out of nursing school. I attended, brought a generous gift, smiled through the toasts, and noticed, quietly, the way my father lingered a beat too long on the topic of my grandmother's farmhouse during a conversation with one of his old golfing friends, describing it as such a shame that a piece of family history like that just sits there mostly empty, most days, while Renata works her long hospital shifts. I remember the small, cold flicker that comment sent through me, the same flicker I had felt as a 12-year-old on the porch step, the sense that somewhere behind a warm, practiced smile, a very old and very familiar kind of math was quietly being run again, and that once more, I was the variable somebody was trying to solve for. The calls started increasing about 8 months before the wedding, slowly at first, the way weather changes before a storm, small shifts in pressure you notice without quite being able to name them. My mother began calling on a Sunday every couple of weeks, instead of the once every month or two we had settled into as our normal rhythm for years. The calls were warm, almost aggressively so, filled with questions about how I was doing, whether I was eating well, whether the hospital was treating me fairly, questions she had genuinely never asked with that kind of consistency in my entire adult life. I want to be honest that some small, stubborn part of me, the same part that had once hoped a beautiful dress and a generous yes would finally earn me a real seat at the family table, let myself soften a little during those calls. I told myself maybe grief over my grandmother had shifted something in my mother. I told myself maybe watching Josie plan a wedding had made her sentimental about family, in a way that was finally, belatedly, including me. The questions, though, always circled back to the same handful of subjects no matter how the conversation started. How was the farmhouse holding up? Had I thought about what repairs it might need? Did I know what similar properties in that area were selling for these days? My father joined a few of these calls toward the end, which was its own quiet red flag, since my father had rarely picked up a phone to speak to me directly in the entirety of my adult life without my mother initiating it first. He asked, with a casualness I now recognize as deeply rehearsed, whether I had ever considered putting the farmhouse into some kind of family trust, just for tax purposes, just to protect it, he said, in case anything ever happened to me unexpectedly. I remember laughing it off in the moment, telling him I appreciated the concern, but that Grandma Eleanor had set everything up properly through her attorney, and I was perfectly comfortable with how things stood. There was a pause on the line after I said that, a pause just half a beat too long, The kind of silence that, in hindsight, I understand now was disappointment, not concern. Around the same time, my mother began weaving the wedding into every single conversation, gently at first, then with increasing insistence, always circling toward the same request. She wanted me to walk Josie down the aisle in our father's place, since his hip had been giving him trouble and he worried about the length of that particular church aisle. She framed it as an honor, as a way for the two sisters to finally have a moment that was truly ours, something sentimental and lovely that the whole family would remember forever. I said yes almost immediately, and I want to admit something uncomfortable here, which is that some small, hungry part of me said yes, not entirely for Josie's sake, but because I desperately wanted to believe that being asked to do something this significant meant I finally mattered to this family in the way I had spent my whole life wishing I did. I have thought about that, yes, more times than I can count in the months since, and I have come to understand that hope, when it has been starved long enough, will accept almost any scrap that looks even a little like being wanted. It was around 6 months before the wedding that my cousin Marla, who has always had a gift for noticing things, and an even greater gift for not being able to keep them to herself, called me one evening just to catch up, and somewhere in the middle of talking about nothing in particular, she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had overheard my parents discussing the farmhouse at a family barbecue the previous weekend, a barbecue I had not been invited to. She said my father had been telling my uncle that it seemed unfair, in his opinion, for that whole property to sit under just one daughter's name when the family as a whole had raised both girls, and that he thought there ought to be a way to, in his words, even things back out before anything unexpected happened to any of us. Marla said she hadn't thought much of it at the time, just family talk, but something about the phrasing had stuck with her enough that she wanted to mention it to me. I thanked her, told her it was probably nothing, and then sat in my kitchen for a long time after we hung up, staring at the same table my grandmother had once slid a manila folder across, feeling that old cold flicker return, sharper this time, less deniable. If you've ever had a family member call more often, ask warmer questions, seem suddenly, suspiciously interested in your life right around the time you finally had something worth having, I want you to comment the words "the warmth had a price" below, because I think a lot of us have lived through exactly that particular kind of affection, and I think it's worth naming out loud how quickly love can look like leverage once you've learned to recognize the difference. It was my grandmother's attorney, Foster Grant, whom I happened to run into at a pharmacy of all places, about 4 months before the wedding, who finally gave the vague unease a shape I could actually act on. We spoke for a few minutes in the checkout line, catching up the way people do, and I mentioned, almost in passing, some of the odd conversations my parents had been having about the farmhouse. His expression changed in a way that told me immediately this was not idle small talk to him. He asked me quietly whether I had ever enrolled the property in a fraud alert system through the county recorder's office, something he said he strongly recommended to all of his clients holding significant inherited property, especially when family dynamics were, and here he chose his words very carefully, complicated. I told him I hadn't even known such a thing existed. He walked me through it right there in that pharmacy parking lot, told me it was free, took 10 minutes to set up online, and would notify me instantly the moment anyone ever tried to file a single document against that property's title. I went home that same night and signed up before I even made dinner, and I want you to remember that detail, because it is the exact reason that email arrived in my inbox 12 minutes before my sister's wedding, instead of arriving weeks or months later, after the damage had already quietly become permanent. The last piece fell into place 2 months before the wedding. During a dinner my mother insisted on hosting at their house, just the 4 of us, she said. A chance to reconnect before all the wedding chaos truly began. Over dessert, my father brought up, with a casualness so deliberate it almost impressed me in hindsight, an old family friend of his who happened to be a notary, mentioning that if I ever needed any documents handled quickly and quietly, this friend could be trusted completely, and worked out of a small office not far from their house. I remember thinking, Even then, before I had any concrete reason to suspect what was coming, that it was a strange thing to bring up unprompted, a strange name to plant in a conversation about nothing at all. I didn't understand the full weight of that comment until the exact moment, 12 minutes before I walked my sister down the aisle, that I opened an email confirming that a forged deed transferring my grandmother's farmhouse had been notarized by a man whose name I had heard exactly once before, at that dinner table, offered to me so casually, I almost hadn't registered it as a warning at all. I stood in that vestibule for exactly 4 minutes after reading the email. 4 minutes I will never fully account for, because some part of my brain simply went into the same clinical stillness I use in a code blue, the part of me that has learned to separate what I feel from what I need to do in the next 60 seconds. I opened the attached document, the recorded quitclaim deed itself, and read every line twice. My name was typed at the top, Renata Cole, grantor, and beneath it sat a signature that was close, disturbingly close, to my own handwriting, but not quite right in the slant of the R, or the way the final E curled back on itself, the kind of forgery that would fool a stranger glancing quickly, but never fool the person whose hand it was supposed to belong to. Below that sat a notary stamp, and a signature I recognized immediately from that dinner table conversation 2 months earlier. The family friend my father had mentioned so casually, offered to me like a helpful tip and not the setup it clearly was. I did the only thing my training has ever taught me to do, when the ground shifts without warning, which is to stop feeling for exactly as long as it takes to gather information, and then feel everything all at once later when it's actually safe to. I photographed every page of that document with my phone before closing the email, time-stamped and saved into a folder I labeled with something boring enough that nobody glancing at my screen would think twice about it. Then I walked back into that sanctuary, linked arms with my sister, and gave her the wedding walk she deserved, because whatever my parents had done, it was not Josie's fault, and I was not willing to let her be collateral damage in the middle of her own vows. I smiled through the ceremony. I mean that literally. I have photographs from that day where I am smiling in a way that looks completely genuine, and only I know what was sitting folded up inside my clutch bag the entire time. The moment the reception moved into its toast and dinner portion, and I had a quiet 15 minutes near the coat check where nobody was watching me closely, I called Foster Grant. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been half expecting a call like this from the moment he'd walked me through that fraud alert system in the pharmacy parking lot months earlier. I read him the details of the deed, the notary's name, the date it had been filed, and I heard him go very quiet on the other end of the line, in a way that confirmed everything I already suspected but hadn't let myself fully name yet. He told me plainly that what I was describing was forgery, a felony, filing a false instrument with the county, the exact kind of crime he had seen destroy families before mine, and he told me the same thing I imagine every good attorney tells a frightened client in that first phone call, which is do not confront them yet, do not let them know you know, because right now you have the strongest possible position, and the moment you tip your hand, that position starts to erode. I want to explain what that advice actually meant for the weeks that followed, because it was, without question, the hardest part of this entire ordeal, harder even than reading that email in the first place. It meant sitting across from my mother at the family brunch the morning after the wedding, watching her ask brightly whether I'd enjoyed myself, whether I thought the flowers had turned out beautifully, and answering warmly, easily, as though I did not have a screenshot of her husband's forged signature sitting in a folder on my phone 3 feet away from her elbow. It meant taking calls from my father over the following weeks in which he continued, with breathtaking casualness, to ask leading questions about the farmhouse, whether I'd thought more about that family trust idea, whether I understood how much simpler things would be if the property were structured a little differently, and answering him each time with the same pleasant vagueness I had perfected over 34 years of learning to survive this exact family. If you have ever had to sit across a table from someone, smiling, nodding, pretending everything was fine, while quietly holding proof of exactly what they had done to you You already know that this particular kind of silence is one of the loneliest things a person can carry, and I want you to comment the words "I held it together" below if that's ever been you, because I think we underestimate how much strength it takes to stay calm when every part of you wants to scream the truth across a dinner table. Foster Grant moved carefully and quickly behind the scenes over the following month. He filed what's called a notice of fraudulent deed with the county, formally flagging the record and beginning the legal process of unwinding the transfer. All of it done quietly enough that my parents had no visibility into it happening. He also connected me with a detective in the county's financial crimes unit, a steady, unhurried man named Detective Aldo Ruiz, who had handled a startling number of cases exactly like mine and told me something in our first meeting that I have carried with me ever since. He said that in his years working these cases, the vast majority of deed forgery he investigated wasn't committed by strangers or scammers overseas, the way people assumed. It was committed by family, sons, daughters, husbands, the very people a victim would have handed a house key to without a second thought. He told me the crime only becomes fully prosecutable once the perpetrators actually try to act on the forged document, to sell it, refinance it, or take physical possession, and that if my parents intended to do anything with that farmhouse, the smartest thing I could do was let them believe they were succeeding, right up until the exact moment they tried. That advice shaped everything that came next. I kept my mother's calls warm. I kept agreeing, vaguely, that a family trust might be worth discussing someday. I let my father believe, week after week, that his forged signature and his careful timing around the wedding chaos had worked exactly as planned. Meanwhile, I quietly built the record Foster and Detective Ruiz needed, saving every text, every voicemail, every leading question my parents asked, time-stamped and organized the exact way I organize a patient's chart, because I have learned that the most dangerous thing you can do in a family like mine is trust your own memory to hold the truth once someone starts trying to rewrite it. I also learned, through careful, patient digging that Foster helped guide, that my parents' finances were in far worse shape than I had ever realized. Credit card debt, stacked against a second mortgage, they had quietly taken out on their own home to keep funding Josie's ventures over the years, a mortgage payment now 3 months behind and climbing. The farmhouse was never sentimental to them. It was collateral, a way to solve a debt problem that had been quietly swallowing their lives while they smiled through country club dinners and wedding toasts, an understanding that finally gave the whole cruel, careful timing of everything a shape that made a terrible kind of sense. The moment we had all been quietly building toward arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, almost 6 weeks after the wedding, when Detective Ruiz called to tell me my parents had scheduled a closing with a small regional lender to refinance the farmhouse under the trust they now controlled, using the forged deed as proof of ownership. They had told the loan officer, according to records Ruiz had already subpoenaed, that the property was going to serve as collateral against their existing debts, and the closing was set for that Friday morning at a title office 20 minutes from my parents' house. Foster Grant explained that this was exactly the moment we had been waiting for. The instant the forgery stopped being paper and started being action, the instant it became a fully provable, fully witnessed crime, instead of a suspicion sitting quietly in a folder. I remember sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot after that call, hands steady on the wheel, the way they always are in a crisis, and feeling, for the first time in this entire ordeal, something that wasn't fear. It was readiness. Ruiz laid out the plan with the same careful patience Foster had shown me from the very beginning. The title office would proceed as scheduled, unaware of anything wrong, and law enforcement would be positioned nearby, ready to move the instant my parents attempted to sign closing documents, using a deed we could now prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, had been forged. Foster suggested I be present, not to confront them dramatically, but simply to be there, calm and visible, holding the one thing that would end any argument before it could even begin, the original notarized copy of my grandmother's actual will alongside the county's own certified record showing the fraudulent filing flagged and under active investigation. I agreed immediately. I had spent 34 years being the daughter who wasn't in the room when decisions about my life got made. I was not going to sit at home while this particular decision got made without me one more time. I arrived at the title office 15 minutes before the scheduled closing and sat in my car across the street, watching my parents' familiar sedan pull into the lot, watching my father ease himself out with his cane, my mother straightening her blazer the way she does before any appointment where appearances matter to her. They walked inside without once glancing my direction, utterly certain, I understood later, that they had already won, that the timing and the notary and the 6 weeks of my careful, pleasant silence meant the whole thing had slipped through cleanly. I gave it exactly 10 minutes, long enough for them to be seated at the closing table with the loan officer, papers spread out, my father's forged signature about to be joined by a second one, before I walked in myself, Foster Grant one step behind me, carrying a slim leather folder of his own. The room went very quiet when I stepped through that door. I want you to understand, I did not raise my voice, not once, through any of what followed, because I had learned a long time ago from my grandmother that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one actually in control of it. I simply walked to the table, set down a single certified copy of the county's fraud notice beside the loan officer's stack of paperwork, and said, calmly, that I believed everyone in this room deserved to know the deed being used to secure this loan had been forged, and that the matter was currently under active criminal investigation. The loan officer's face changed instantly, the particular color drain of someone realizing they were about to be caught in the middle of a felony they had no part in creating. My mother's mouth opened and then closed again, without a single sound coming out, the first time in my entire life I had ever seen her genuinely speechless. My father recovered first, the way he always has, reaching for the same authoritative tone he'd used my whole childhood to end conversations he didn't want to have. He said this was a private family matter, and that I had no right coming in here making accusations in front of strangers, that whatever misunderstanding I had gotten myself confused about could be sorted out at home, later, quietly, the way our family always sorted things. I looked at him, and I felt something settle inside me that I can only describe as the exact opposite of the 12-year-old on that porch step, the girl who used to believe that staying quiet was the price of eventually being loved. I told him there was no misunderstanding, that I had a certified copy of his own forged signature sitting on that table in front of him, notarized by a man he himself had recommended to me at his own dinner table 2 months before he used him, and that the loan officer beside him was currently a witness to a man attempting to close a fraudulent loan using a felony deed. That was the exact moment Detective Ruiz walked through the door with 2 uniformed officers behind him, and I want to be honest that even after everything, even after months of quiet preparation, watching my own father's face go the color of old paper as the reality of what was actually happening finally landed on him was not something I felt any triumph in. I felt something quieter and heavier than that. My mother started crying almost immediately. Not the practiced tears she'd worn at Josie's wedding, but something rawer, and she kept saying, over and over, that they had only done it because they had no other choice, that the debts had gotten so far out of hand, that they had always planned to make it right eventually, as though intention could somehow undo a felony already committed in full. My father said nothing at all once the handcuffs came out, sitting very still in that chair, an old man suddenly looking every bit his 63 years, and something in his silence told me he had known, on some level, all along, exactly how wrong this was, and had simply decided, the way he always had, that it was worth the risk if it meant one more solution paid for at my expense instead of his own. If you have ever had to sit in a room and watch the people who raised you finally face the consequences of decisions they never once believed would catch up to them, I want you to comment the words, "the truth caught up" below, because I think there is a particular, complicated grief in watching justice actually happen to your own parents. A grief that has almost nothing to do with pity for them and everything to do with mourning the family you always wished you'd had, instead of the one that finally stood revealed in that quiet title office, papers scattered across the table, my mother crying into a monogrammed handkerchief that suddenly looked nothing at all like the one she'd used to perform tears at my sister's wedding. The weeks after that afternoon in the title office unfolded exactly the way Foster Grant had quietly predicted they would. My father was charged with forgery and filing a fraudulent instrument, both felonies, and my mother, though she had not physically forged the signature, was charged as an accessory once phone records and the loan officer's statement confirmed she had been present for and actively participating in the closing itself. Neither of them went to trial. The evidence was simply too complete, too carefully documented, the forged signature, the notary's own testimony once he realized he was facing charges of his own, the recorded conversations Foster had helped me preserve, the fraud alert timestamp proving I had known within minutes rather than months. My father accepted a plea deal that spared him significant prison time in exchange for probation and full restitution, though restitution from two people already drowning in debt from years of funding a lifestyle and a daughter's failed ventures turned out to be a bitterly hollow kind of justice, more paperwork than payment. My mother's charges were eventually reduced to a lesser offense, given her more limited role, but the record now exists permanently, a fact no country club dinner or family gathering will ever quietly erase again. The county voided the fraudulent deed within weeks, and the farmhouse returned, cleanly and permanently, to exactly where my grandmother had always intended it to sit, in my name alone. I changed nothing about how I lived there. I still drive out after long ICU shifts to sit on that same porch where she once told me some parents only have room in their hearts for one kind of daughter, and I have come to understand, slowly, that she was both right and not quite right at the same time. My parents never did have room in their hearts for the daughter I actually was. But somewhere along the way, I built an entire family that did, and I think that distinction is the whole point of everything I have learned since that Tuesday I found that email standing in a church vestibule in a champagne-colored dress. Josie and I have spoken many times since the wedding, carefully, honestly, in a way we never quite managed before all of this happened. She was devastated when the truth came out, not for our parents' sake, but because she told me, crying on my porch one evening months later, that she had spent her entire life assuming the family's math simply worked the way math works, without ever once questioning who was carrying the weight of the numbers that never quite added up in my favor. She apologized for things she genuinely hadn't known to apologize for before. For never once asking why I was always the one carpooling, always the one working through fevers, always the one standing quietly at the edge of family photographs while the camera stayed charged for her recitals. I told her the truth, which is that I never blamed her for being loved the way a child should be loved. I only ever wished someone had loved us both that way. We are rebuilding something now, slower and more honest than what we had before, built on actual conversation instead of inherited silence, and I think, given everything, that might be the truest kind of family I could have hoped to salvage from all of this. My father writes to me sometimes now from the terms of his probation, careful letters in his familiar handwriting, apologizing in ways that feel more complete than anything he ever managed to say out loud across 34 years of dinner tables. I have not fully forgiven him, and I am not certain I ever fully will, but I read every letter because I have learned that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same transaction, and that you are allowed to hold space for the possibility of one without owing anyone the other on any particular timeline. My mother and I speak rarely, and when we do, the conversations are shorter, more careful, stripped of the practiced warmth that I now understand was never really about me at all. I have made a kind of peace with that distance, the same peace my grandmother modeled for me every single Sunday on that porch, the peace of loving someone honestly for exactly what they can give you, and refusing to bankrupt yourself waiting for more. I think about my grandmother almost every single day, usually right there at that kitchen table where she first taught me to read a bank statement and shell peas at the same time, and I think about the folder she slid across to me that ordinary Tuesday evening, the one that held decades of careful, patient proof that somebody in this family had finally decided my worth deserved to be written down permanently, in ink nobody could quietly erase at a dinner table ever again. I understand now, in a way I couldn't have as a 12-year-old on that porch step, that she was not simply protecting a house. She was protecting the truth of who I was, insisting on it, documenting it, making certain that whatever pressure ever came, there would be an honest, undeniable record standing between me and anyone who tried to convince me I had imagined the unfairness I had felt my entire life. If there is one thing I want you to take away from everything I have told you tonight, it is this. If you have spent your life being the daughter, the son, the sibling who somehow never quite made the cut, who learned to celebrate quietly, to carpool 90 minutes early, to smile through the moments that should have broken your heart, I want you to know that the math you felt as a child was never wrong. You were not imagining it. And I want you to know that it is never too late to become the kind of person who documents her own worth, who builds a life so solid and so honestly earned, that when the people who once dismissed you finally come looking for what you built, you are ready, calm, and standing exactly where you belong. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story tonight. If any part of what I shared reminded you of your own family, your own quiet math, your own porch step conversation with the one person who finally saw you clearly, I want you to tell me about it in the comments below, because I read every single one, and I promise you, whatever you carry from your own version of this story, you are not carrying it alone tonight. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs to hear tonight that it is never too late to stop being quiet. I will see you in the next story.